One of Rogue Trader's biggest strengths has always been its ability to make Warhammer 40k feel weird and outlandish, yet also deeply personal. The Infinite Museion doubles down on that by introducing a delightfully eccentric tech priest and sending you on the galaxy's most dangerous museum tour. So after spending a week with the DLC, is the Infinite Museion an essential addition to Rogue Trader or merely a pleasant diversion? The story kicks off with you meeting the new companion, Eogunn, an unusually jovial seeker of knowledge who treats the line between curiosity and insanity like a seesaw. One of the first things you see him do is create a Frankenstein's monster out of several fatally wounded soldiers. His goal is noble, to save at least something of them and give them a second chance at life. But as you might imagine, stapling 3 people together does not exactly go according to plan. But what really surprised me, however, is that Eogunn actually admits he was wrong. He even goes as far as to suggest that, in his eagerness, he may have actually committed heresy, the greatest sin against the Omnissiah. Getting that kind of introspection from a tech priest is as rare as a dog that won't instantly vacuum up food as soon as it hits the floor. Because of that, he serves as a very interesting counterpart to Pascal. Whereas Pascal often feels more machine than man, Eogunn represents a true union between the two. He's actually happy to be alive, enjoys talking to people, and can even appreciate the occasional joke. So as someone that loves the Adeptus Mechanicus, it was wonderful seeing a tech priest characterized as something other than a robed weirdo that goes beep boop. Not that Eogunn isn't a robed weirdo. He is basically a balloon with tentacles and a face. And instead of just being a normal kind of crazy, he created an imaginary friend whose main purpose is to tell him he's being an idiot. Their relationship is honestly kind of cute, which is not something I expected I would ever say in regards to a tech priest, but here we are. In true Rogue Trader fashion, his story takes some wild twists and turns, though I won't spoil the details. What I will say is that I found the central dilemma to be fascinating, even if the whole thing was a bit too abrupt for my liking. The quest unfolds over multiple chapters, but the bulk of the narrative arrives only really during the final stretch. I would have loved a few more conversations exploring the conflict, because right now you go from discovering the problem to resolving it in only a couple of steps. It sure would be nice if that's how it worked in real life. But on a more serious note, this doesn't ruin the quest or the character, but it is an unfortunate blemish on an otherwise excellent new companion. And much like the previous DLCs, the Infinite Museion is blended seamlessly into the main campaign. There isn't a chunky bit remaining. In fact, I am pretty sure a new player would have no chance to separate the DLC's madness from Rogue Trader's usual fare. For example, there's a new Adeptus Mechanicus oil rig you can stumble across where 2 different sects of tech priests are engaged in a heated philosophical debate. And also a shooting war. It has almost nothing to do with the main story, but it is a fun little detour that offers some extra insight into the tech priests and their wonderfully deranged beliefs. Then there's also Zarkov, a brand new colony world complete with new quests, upgrades, and the usual assortment of planetary crises you can solve from the comfort of your throne. It fits into the campaign so naturally it feels like it was always meant to be there. But that's not the only natural thing about it, because Zarkov is a planet overrun by evil vegetables that enjoy eating people almost as much as they enjoy torturing them. But what's really surprising is that Zarkov isn't full of gibbering madmen. Instead, it's run by descendants of a penal legion that have spent so long under impossible pressure that they have learned to use every part of a guardsman, if you know what I mean. And if you don't, that's probably for the best. Oh, and they even have their own theme song.
Dead and lost forever, taken from us too.
So if you want to claim the planet, you'll need to help the Zarkovians deal with the Drover, which is essentially Audrey from Little Shop of Horrors. This ended up being one of my favorite fights in the DLC. My first attempt ended up with a complete failure as an endless tide of flowers vomited all over my party before I could even leave my little shame corner. But the second time around I brought significantly more firepower, and the emphasis is on fire, and after a bit of aggressive weed whacking, Zarkov officially joined my domain. This is also where I was reminded that Rogue Trader's writing was, and still is, excellent across the board. Owlcat has an uncanny ability to make me care about characters that might as well be named Joe the Poop Shoveler for how important they really are in the main storyline. So despite spending maybe an hour with them, I found the Zarkov crew to be surprisingly memorable, which is very, very fortunate because they don't disappear once the quest ends. The newly liberated Zarkov regiments pop up at other points in the campaign, including the DLC's finale. They don't play a massive role. I mean, they're just some dudes high on corpse poison, but seeing them acknowledged as a part of your retinue makes the world feel just that little bit more reactive, and I really, really like seeing that kind of stuff. This then leads, through events I won't spoil, into the Infinite Museion itself. And honestly, I loved my first trip through it. The whole thing begins as a guided tour through some of the strangest creatures and artifacts in the entire galaxy, before eventually culminating in an interactive exhibit dedicated to everyone's favorite Suicide Squad, the Death Corps of Krieg. The fight against them was fine. Fun, but nothing too special. But what made it really memorable for me was pure random chance. A Krieg commissar suffered lethal damage and then simply absolutely refused to die out of sheer stubbornness. He then proceeded to scream at one of his own soldiers, attempted to shoot another in the back, missed completely, and then exploded into a shower of giblets, like any good Krieger. I don't think you could have scripted that encounter any better. But the coolest part of the Museion, and probably the highlight of the DLC for me, is the time loop exhibition. You're dropped into an ongoing siege, and your job is to cause so much chaos that the simulation throws a hissy fit and then self-destructs. Or you can just blow it up with a bomb, but come on now. If you choose that option, you need to seriously re-examine your priorities in life. Because the time loop is a quintessential CRPG quest. Tightly designed, packed with memorable characters, and full of decisions that have actual consequences. More importantly, it's not just about figuring out what to do and how, but also when. Everything you do advances the simulation. Talk to someone, time passes. Poke a radio, time passes. As a result, dismantling the whole thing becomes a giant puzzle. You need to figure out the right sequence of events, manipulate the various characters, and sometimes even get your hands dirty. I spent about an hour poking and prodding every corner of it to get the good ending, and honestly I had a blast. Especially because the thing I was missing the whole time was actually super obvious, yet something I never even considered. I needed to intentionally fail a conversation to change how events play out. The time loop was such a strong section that it also highlights my biggest disappointment with the Infinite Museion. And before the pitchforks come out, I need to make a confession. I have never cared for Trayzn. He always felt a bit too self-indulgent, and that really is saying something given how silly Warhammer 40k really is. And unfortunately, the Infinite Museion hasn't really changed my mind. Part of the problem is that Trayzn just isn't that exciting as a villain. He doesn't want the player because they're essential to some kind of a grand scheme. He wants them because they would look good as Exhibit 420,690, which compared to Eogunn, Zarkov, or the Time Loop isn't nearly as personal or as interesting. Which is a shame because the Museion itself absolutely is. So much so that when it finally came time to raid it and engage in a little friendly fisticuffs with Trayzn, I was genuinely quite excited. In my mind, I imagined Trayzn getting increasingly desperate and throwing his prize collection at us. One second you'll be fighting some bizarre alien monstrosity and then bam, suddenly a Chaos Dreadnought would just crash through the ceiling. You know, that kind of thing. Instead, the finale is basically just a difficult Necron fight. Yeah, I wiped out once and had to retry, as Trayzn the Infinite didn't get his name because he really likes Halo. But compared to the Drover, which is a completely unique boss, or the Time Loop, which is a completely unique scenario, the final confrontation felt surprisingly conventional. And that's honestly kind of my issue with it. The DLC spends most of its time showing off wonderfully bizarre ideas and moral dilemmas, only for the finale to fall back on something you'll see dozens and dozens of times throughout Chapter 5. Now this doesn't make it bad, far from it. The fight can be downright nasty, and I really like how, mid-fight, you can make a decision that directly influences the ending. It's just that Rogue Trader set such a high standard for itself that merely good now feels like being served plain mashed potatoes after a 5-course meal. On the bright side, I did get the projectile vomit directly into Trayzn's face, which I must admit I found very satisfying. And no, that is not a joke. That is an actual augment you can get. Instead of simply improving your characters through gear, you can now shove bits and pieces of metal in them in order to unlock new abilities or amplify what they already have. While Forge World characters and the 2 Tech Priest companions have a slight edge, everyone is able to embrace the certainty of steel. And it is a very interesting system since many of the augments offer plus-minus style effects that, if you overindulge, can really come back to bite you. Still, I found it powerful enough that most of my crew ended up getting chromed out. Because if you're going to be fighting demons from beyond the stars, an Ogryn-sized arm certainly does help. Eogunn is especially exciting here as a lot of his power comes from his augments. He is able to arc lightning between enemies, shield allies in a spiky field of static, and even create an electric wall that hurts enemies and somehow buffs your projectiles. So as far as new systems go, I would say the augments are a smash hit. They fit seamlessly into the game, offer interesting choices, and just feel good to mess around with. But more than that, they also come with their own little story, one that discusses where exactly the line between man and machine truly lies. It is a fascinating conundrum and the game presents it really well, it's just that, much like Eogunn's story, it needed a little bit more room to really breathe. As it stands, it's thought-provoking but just a bit too condensed. Which is pretty much how I would summarize the Infinite Museion as a whole. There is nothing here that I would call bad. In fact, most of it is great. It's just that I kept running into moments where I really wanted the DLC to do a little bit more with its ideas before moving on to the next thing. The companion storyline needed a few more conversations. The augmentation dilemma deserves a little more exploration. And the finale never quite reaches the same heights as the time loop exhibition that came before it. But despite those shortcomings, the Infinite Museion succeeds at the one thing Rogue Trader does best. Whether you're helping a balloon-shaped tech priest wrestle with impossible questions, liberating a planet from evil vegetables, or deliberately trying to break reality, there's always something weird and very memorable around every corner. So as far as Rogue Trader expansions go, I would put the Infinite Museion in second place behind Void Shadows. It's not something I would call mandatory, but it is absolutely worth a playthrough, especially if the idea of wandering through the galaxy's most dangerous museum sounds like a fun evening to you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing, as that really does help me out a lot, and I'll hopefully see you again soon. Bye bye!